If I were to tell you that there was once a creature that weighed as much as an elephant, had claws longer than kitchen knives, stood tall enough to look a giraffe in the eyes, and moved slower than your grandmother on a Sunday morning, you'd probably say, yeah, that tracks. Big animals are slow, right? Animals are... just look at modern sloths. They're basically the poster children for taking your sweet time, moving so slowly that algae literally grows on them. So naturally, you'd assume their ancient relatives, the giant ground sloths, were even more sluggish given that they were roughly 50 times heavier. And yet, somehow, some of these absolute units could not only move fast, but were actually capable of outrunning a horse. Yes, you heard that right. A horse. The animal we specifically bred for speed. And we're not talking about some sad, arthritic horse either. We're talking about a healthy horse at full gallop. But how is that even remotely possible for a creature that looks like it was designed by a committee that couldn't decide between terrifying and adorably chunky? Well, buckle up, because the answer's way weirder than you'd think. Now, before we get into the whole speed thing, let's talk about what giant ground sloths actually were, because I guarantee the mental image you have right now is probably wrong. When most people hear giant sloth, they imagine something like the sloths we have today. You know, those adorably derpy tree-dwelling creatures from the Amazon that look perpetually stoned, except just scaled up like a Pokemon evolution. And to be fair, that's not entirely unreasonable considering modern sloths and ground sloths are related. But here's the thing. Calling a giant ground sloth a big tree sloth is like calling a grizzly bear a large hamster, just because they're both rodent adjacent. Technically related? Sure. Accurate? Absolutely not. These guys were monsters, and I mean that in the most respectful way possible. Take Megatherium americanum, probably the most well-known giant ground sloth, which lived in South America until about 10,000 years ago. This absolute unit stood up to 6 meters or 20 feet tall when on its hind legs. That's basically the height of a 2-story building. When on all fours, which was its preferred method of getting around, it still measured about 4 meters or 13 feet in length and weighed somewhere between 3 to 4 tons. To put that in perspective, that's heavier than a fully loaded Ford F-150 pickup truck and about the same weight as a male African elephant. Your average sedan weighs maybe 1.5 tons, so imagine 2 cars duct taped together, given claws, and told to go forage for leaves. That's essentially what we're dealing with here, but Megatherium wasn't even the biggest ground sloth to ever exist. That title goes to Megatherium's chonky cousin, Erematherium, which could reach up to 5 tons. Basically a mid-sized SUV with claws and an attitude. And speaking of those claws, each one measured up to 30 centimeters, or roughly 12 inches long, which is about the length of a standard ruler, and they were curved like meat hooks. These weren't delicate little gardening tools either. These claws were built to strip bark off trees, dig up roots, and probably ruin the day of anything stupid enough to mess with them. So yeah, you definitely didn't want to get into a disagreement with one of these guys at the local watering hole. Now, with all that bulk, you'd naturally assume they moved like, well, modern sloths, at a pace that makes a snail look like it's training for the Olympics. After all, basic physics would suggest that the bigger you are, the more energy it takes to move all that mass around, right? Modern elephants, despite their power, only reach top speeds of about 25 kilometers or 15 miles per hour. Rhinos, despite being built like organic battering rams, only hit about 50 kilometers or 31 miles per hour at their absolute fastest. So surely a 4-ton sloth would be lucky to break into a brisk walk, let alone a run. At least, that's what paleontologists thought for a very, very long time. And boy, were they wrong. So here's where everything you think you know goes out the window. In 2019, a team of researchers decided to take a closer look at the biomechanics of these prehistoric beasts, specifically focusing on their limb bones, muscle attachment points, and skeletal structure. What they found was, and I cannot stress this enough, completely bonkers. Turns out, certain species of giant ground sloths, particularly the smaller ones like Glossitherium and Lestodon, and yes, smaller is relative here since they still weighed about 1.5 tons, which is roughly the weight of a Honda Civic, had limb proportions that were absolutely jacked for running. Their leg bones showed evidence of massive muscle attachment sites, particularly around the femur and tibia, suggesting they had leg muscles that would make a bodybuilder jealous. But more importantly, When researchers analyzed the angles and leverage points of these bones, they discovered that these sloths had biomechanics similar to modern cursorial animals. That's science speak for animals built for running. We're talking about muscle and bone arrangements similar to what you'd find in horses, deer, and other animals that need to book it when predators show up. Which is absolutely wild when you remember we're discussing an animal that looks like a bear and a sloth had a baby, and then that baby ate nothing but protein powder for its entire life. But wait, it gets better. Using computer models and comparing the skeletal structure to modern animals, researchers estimated that these medium-sized ground sloths could potentially reach speeds of up to 60 kilometers per hour or 37 miles per hour. For comparison, the average horse gallops at about 40 to 48 kilometers, or 25 to 30 miles per hour, with only the fastest breeds like thoroughbreds hitting 60 kilometers per hour during short bursts. So yeah, these slow sloths could legitimately keep pace with or even outrun your average horse. A ground sloth could have beaten Seabiscuit. Let that sink in for a second. Now you're probably wondering why it took us so long to figure this out. Well, for most of the 19th and 20th centuries, paleontologists were working with incomplete skeletons and making assumptions based on, well, modern sloths. The first Megatherium skeleton was discovered in Argentina in 1788 and was so bizarre looking that early scientists had absolutely no idea what to make of it. Thomas Jefferson, yes, that Thomas Jefferson, the one on the $2 bill, was actually obsessed with ground sloth fossils and even named a species, Megalonyx jeffersoni, after himself. But Jefferson thought it was some kind of giant lion because the claws looked so predatory. It wasn't until the 1800s that scientists realized it was related to sloths, and by then the damage was done. Everyone just assumed sloth equals slow, and didn't question it for another 2 centuries. Turns out confirmation bias is a hell of a drug. And here's the real kicker. These speed demons weren't outliers or weird mutations. Multiple species of ground sloths showed similar adaptations for speed. Glossotherium, Lestodon, even some of the North American species like Paramylodon showed evidence of being capable runners. This wasn't a fluke. This was a legitimate evolutionary strategy that worked for millions of years. These guys evolved to be fast, probably to escape predators like saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears, and later humans with pointy sticks. Turns out, when you're basically a walking buffet for every mega predator on the continent, being able to haul ass is pretty important, regardless of how much you weigh. But here's where things get even weirder, because you'd think that being built for speed would require, normal feet and legs like every other fast animal. Nope. Ground sloths said, screw conventional wisdom, and decided to run on their knuckles. Yes, you read that right. These guys were knuckle walkers. Similar to gorillas, except instead of walking on the knuckles of their hands, they walked on the knuckles of their feet. Their massive claws were so long and curved that they literally couldn't place their feet flat on the ground without snapping them off, or at least making walking incredibly awkward. So evolution just said, fine, walk on your knuckles then. And somehow, this janky biomechanical nightmare of a setup still allowed them to hit highway speeds. It's like if someone told you they won the Boston Marathon while wearing high heels backwards. Nature is wild. And then there's the gut situation, which honestly deserves its own documentary. See, giant ground sloths were herbivores, which means they had to process massive amounts of plant material to fuel their enormous bodies. We're talking about a digestive system that would make a cow's look efficient by comparison. Their stomach alone could hold up to 500 liters, that's 132 gallons, of fermenting plant matter. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried running with a full stomach, but let me tell you, it's not fun. Now imagine trying to sprint with 132 gallons of grass smoothie sloshing around in your gut. That's roughly equivalent to running with 2 full bathtubs strapped to your torso. And yet these mad lads still managed to pull it off. Researchers think they must have had incredibly strong abdominal muscles, and possibly some kind of internal support structure to keep everything from just flopping around like a water balloon in a paint mixer. Oh, and did I mention they had a tail that basically functioned as a third leg? Because they did. When ground sloths stood upright, which they did frequently to reach high vegetation or intimidate predators, they'd use their absolutely massive tails as a tripod support, creating a stable three-point stance. This tail was so thick and muscular that in some species, it measured over a meter in diameter at the base. That's wider than most tree trunks. Paleontologists have found ground sloth trackways that show impressions of this tail being dragged behind them, and in some cases, you can actually see where they pivoted on it. Imagine being a saber-toothed cat thinking you've got an easy meal, and this sloth just casually stands up to its full 20-foot height, bounces on its tail like some kind of biological kickstand, and then decides to just run at you. At 37 miles per hour. While carrying 132 gallons of partially digested vegetation, because apparently ground sloths had absolutely no chill whatsoever and were determined to violate every assumption we had about how large animals should work. But wait, there's more, because evolution apparently wasn't done making these guys absolutely ridiculous. Recent studies have also suggested that ground sloths might have had a unique thermoregulation system, which is fancy science talk for staying cool while running around in a fur coat. See, being that big comes with serious heat problems. When your 4 tons of muscle and fat just existing generates a lot of body heat, and running generates even more. Modern elephants have to stop and rest frequently to avoid overheating, and they've evolved giant ears specifically to help cool down. Ground sloths. They said ears are for quitters, and instead developed a network of blood vessels near the surface of their skin that basically turned their entire body into a radiator. Some researchers think this is why they had such thick, shaggy fur, not for warmth, but to create air pockets that would help regulate their temperature while running. So basically, they were wearing a built-in cooling vest while sprinting. It's like they looked at every other large mammal's cooling strategy and said, "Nah, we're going to do our own thing." And if you're wondering how they fueled all this speed despite eating nothing but plants, well, that's another weird part. Unlike modern sloths, which have the slowest metabolism of any mammal, seriously, they defecate once a week because their digestion is that slow. Ground sloths likely had a metabolism somewhere between a cow and a horse. Not super fast, but fast enough to support bursts of speed when needed. Think of them less like marathoners and more like powerlifters who can sprint when properly motivated. And what motivated them? Not dying, mostly. Which, fair enough, is pretty good motivation. So what does all this speed actually mean for the ecosystems these guys lived in? Well, quite a lot, actually. For one, it completely changes our understanding of predator-prey dynamics during the Pleistocene. For decades, paleontologists assumed that giant ground sloths were basically slow-moving targets that relied entirely on their size and claws for defense, kind of like prehistoric tanks that just sat there and took hits. But if they could actually run, that means they had another option. Just leave. This would have made them significantly harder to hunt, which might explain why they survived for so long, despite being surrounded by literal nightmares like Smilodon, short-faced bears that stood 12 feet tall, and dire wolves that hunted in packs. When you've got the option to either stand and fight with your foot-long claws or just peace out at 37 miles per hour, you've got a pretty solid survival strategy. It also suggests that ground sloths were way more adaptable than we gave them credit for. Speed requires agility, and agility requires brain power to coordinate all those moving parts. Recent studies of ground sloth skull cavities suggest they had relatively large brains for herbivores, particularly in the cerebellum, the part that handles motor control and spatial awareness. In other words, these guys weren't just fast, they were probably pretty smart too, at least smart enough to know when to run and when to stand and fight. This actually means that ground sloths might have been capable of fairly complex behaviors, possibly even social cooperation when defending against predators or competing for resources. And speaking of knowing when to run, let's talk about humans, because we almost certainly crossed paths with these speed demons. Ground sloths survived in South America until about 10,000 years ago, and in North America until roughly 11,000 years ago, which means early human inhabitants definitely encountered them. We have evidence of human hunting sites with ground sloth remains, including cut marks on bones and stone tools found nearby. Some sites even show evidence of butchering stations where multiple sloths were processed, suggesting that humans figured out how to hunt them successfully. Now here's the wild part. If ground sloths could actually run at 37 miles per hour, that means hunting them would have been significantly more difficult than previously thought. You couldn't just corner one and wait for it to tire out like you could with a mammoth. It could potentially outrun you and had the stamina to keep going. This might explain why we see evidence of ambush tactics and pit traps at some sites, rather than the persistence hunting methods that worked on other megafauna. Humans had to get creative when hunting an animal that was simultaneously the size of an elephant, armed with foot-long claws, and capable of outrunning a horse. Talk about a boss fight. Whether their speed helped them survive longer or made them more vulnerable by requiring more food to maintain. Running burns a lot of calories, after all, is still debated. But what we do know is that by about 10,000 years ago, the last giant ground sloths were gone, leaving behind only their smaller, tree-dwelling cousins, who took one look at the whole being fast and enormous strategy and decided speed was overrated. So let's circle back to where we started, the idea that giant ground sloths were faster than horses. Sounds absolutely bananas, right? And yet, here we are with biomechanical evidence, computer models, and fossil analysis all pointing to the same conclusion. These 4-ton herbivores with foot-long claws, a digestive system full of grass soup, and knuckles for feet could legitimately outrun the animals we specifically bred for speed over thousands of years. They could sprint while walking on their knuckles. They could balance on their tails like a biological kickstand. They could regulate their temperature with a fur coat that worked like a cooling system. They were basically nature's way of saying, your physics are boring, watch this. But here's maybe the craziest part of all this. We only figured this out in the last few years. For over 2 centuries, we just assumed these creatures were slow because, well, their modern relatives are slow. We let one behavioral trait of a completely different animal in a completely different environment dictate our understanding of an entire family of megafauna. It just goes to show that even in paleontology, our biggest assumptions are often the ones that need the most scrutiny. So, the next time you see a modern sloth hanging from a tree, moving at approximately 0.15 meters per hour, and looking like it's contemplating the heat death of the universe, just remember, its ancestors could have dusted Secretariat in a foot race while weighing as much as a car and carrying the equivalent of 2 bathtubs full of salad. Evolution is weird. Nature is absolutely metal. And sometimes the slowest animals alive have the fastest skeletons in their family tree. Talk about a glow down. Thanks for watching, and until next time, remember that everything you think you know about prehistoric life is probably wrong in the best possible way.